The rain had a way of softening the edges of Shanghai. It blurred the glow of the street lamps, turned the cobblestones slick, and carried the faint hum of life through narrow alleyways. But in the 1920s, the rain could not wash away the scent that clung to certain streets, thick, sweet, and strangely heavy. It was the scent of opium seeping out from behind paper-screen doors and half-closed shutters, winding its way into the heart of the city. For some, it was the smell of comfort. For others, the smell of ruin. And for the countless strangers who drifted into the city in search of something they couldn't name, it was an invitation they didn't know they'd accepted. Shanghai was a city of contradictions. The Grand French Concession stood only a rickshaw right away from cramped Chinese lanes where laundry swayed between leaning buildings. British policemen patrolled near gambling dens, and elegant cafes served coffee just around the corner from tea houses where fortunes were read in porcelain cups. But nothing was more polarizing, more whispered about, than the opium dens. They were neither entirely hidden nor openly advertised, places you had to be shown, not just found. And yet, once you crossed their threshold, you entered a world that felt almost detached from time itself. I first heard about them from an old sailor, a man with weathered hands and a voice so low you had to lean in to catch his words. He said the dens were like dream factories, where time bent and hours melted into each other. Some came to escape pain, some to chase beauty, and others, well, they came because there was nothing else left. He didn't smile when he told me this. He just stared out toward the Huangpu River as if he could still see faces from decades ago, drifting away like the smoke itself. Inside, the dens were nothing like the noisy, chaotic city outside. Curtains muffled the sound of the streets, and the air was so still you could hear the soft pop of an oil lamp or the slow, rhythmic breath of someone deep in the haze. Shadows clung to the corners. A stranger could lie down, light a pipe, and vanish into a dream before you even knew their name. Sometimes you never did. But to understand the opium dens of Old Shanghai, you had to understand the city that birthed them. Shanghai was a port city, a magnet for merchants, fortune seekers, criminals, and wanderers. By day, you could walk along the Bund and see ships from every corner of the globe unloading their cargo. Silk from Suzhou, spices from Southeast Asia, crates of foreign liquor, and sometimes, in hidden compartments, the opium that fueled an entire hidden economy. By night, the city shifted. The lanterns burned lower, the streets thinned out, and behind discreet doors in the labyrinth of alleys, the dens awoke. They were rarely what you imagined. Not all were dim and dirty. Some were lush, with silk cushions and intricate screens painted with cranes and lotus flowers. The wealthier patrons could afford attendants who prepared their pipes for them, heating the black gum over small flames, rolling it carefully, and placing it in the bowl with practiced elegance. For them, the ritual was part of the allure, slow, deliberate, and almost ceremonial. In humbler dens, the walls were bare, the mats thin, and the smoke thick enough to hide the faces around you. But in every den, there was the same quiet, an unspoken agreement that once you stepped inside, the outside world didn't matter. Yet beneath that quiet was something else, an unease, a sense that while you were drifting away, someone was watching. Not every den was run by men with kind faces. Power in Shanghai was never simple. There were the tongs, the secret societies, the corrupt officials who looked the other way in exchange for favors. The dens were woven into this web. You might think you were just paying for an hour of escape, but in truth, you were stepping into a place where deals were made, debts were decided, and sometimes lives were changed forever. One rainy evening, I followed a man namedly into one of these places. He was a wiry fellow, quick in his movements, but always with eyes darting like he was expecting someone to follow. He claimed he knew the real Shanghai, not the one you read about in newspapers. He led me through side streets I'd never seen, past stalls selling roasted chestnuts and skewers of candied hawthorn, until we reached a door so plain I almost missed it. He knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. The door opened just enough for us to slip inside. The first thing I noticed was the smell, heavier than anything outside, sweet but almost metallic, as if the smoke itself had weight. The room was dim, lit by a few low lamps. People lay along narrow wooden platforms, their heads on small blocks, pipes in hand. No one spoke. A woman in a pale blue robe moved quietly between them, her hand steady as she prepared a fresh pipe for an older man whose face was drawn and hollow. In the far corner, a young foreigner sat alone, staring into the flame of his lamp as if waiting for something. Lee whispered to me not to stare. "Some people don't like questions here," he said. I nodded, but my eyes kept drifting. There was a strange tension in the air, as if everyone in that room shared some secret I didn't know. I was just beginning to think maybe I'd made a mistake following Lee here when the door at the far end opened. Two men stepped in, dressed too finely for this part of town. They moved with the kind of confidence that meant they didn't fear anyone here. The woman in the pale blue robe froze mid-step. Conversations that had been whispered in the corner stopped. Even the young foreigner sat up straighter, his pipe set down beside him. Lee's hand tightened on my arm. "That's not good," he murmured. The two men scanned the room, their eyes sharp, lingering on each face for a second too long. Then, without a word, they walked toward the corner where the older man lay. The woman in blue stepped between them and the bed, her voice low but firm. I couldn't hear what she said, but I saw the taller man's mouth curl into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And then, well, that's the thing about Shanghai in those days. You never knew when you were walking into something much bigger than you could understand. The taller man took one slow step closer, his polished leather shoes making almost no sound on the wooden floor. The woman in blue didn't move, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her grip tightened on the pipe she still held. For a moment, no one breathed. The smoke hung between them like a curtain, twisting and curling as if it, too, were listening. The shorter man finally spoke, his voice low and even, but there was a weight to it. "We've come for him," he said, tilting his head toward the old man on the platform. His Cantonese was crisp, deliberate. The woman's reply was quiet, but her words carried an edge. "He's not ready to leave." The taller man chuckled, an empty sound. "He doesn't have a choice." I shifted my weight, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The old man didn't look dangerous. He looked like someone who had drifted far from the world, half here, half lost in the haze. Why would these two care about him? And why would the woman risk standing in their way? Lee gave a barely perceptible shake of his head, warning me to stay quiet. His eyes, though, were locked on the two newcomers, and I realized he knew exactly who they were. One of the other patrons, a man in a dark cap, slowly sat up and reached for his coat. His movement drew the taller man's gaze. And in that moment, the woman in blue stepped sideways, placing herself between the old man and the men once again. The shorter one sighed, almost theatrically, as though tired of a game he didn't want to play. "Do you really want to make this difficult?" he asked her. Her voice was steady. "This place has rules." It was the first time I understood that the den wasn't just a business. It was a kind of sanctuary. The outside world's power struggles and debts weren't supposed to follow you in here. At least, that's how it was meant to be. But in Shanghai, rules only mattered until someone stronger decided they didn't. The taller man reached into his coat. The movement was slow enough to be deliberate, a signal to everyone watching. I couldn't see what he was pulling out, but the room's energy shifted. The young foreigner in the corner leaned forward, his expression tightening. The man in the dark cap froze halfway through putting on his coat. Even the old man on the platform stirred, his clouded eyes opening just enough to take in the scene. Lee tugged at my sleeve. "We're leaving," he whispered. But I couldn't move, not yet. Something about the way the old man's gaze lingered on the taller man told me there was a story here, one with roots deep in the city's underbelly. Then, before anything could happen, the den's back door swung open. A rush of cooler air swept in, and with it, a figure in a heavy coat stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his hat pulled low over his eyes. No one spoke his name, but the reaction was instant. The taller of the two men stiffened. The shorter one's mouth pressed into a thin line. The newcomer didn't look at me, or at Lee, or even at the woman in blue. He went straight to the corner where the old man lay. He knelt, said something too low for me to hear, and the old man's expression changed. Faint recognition flickered there. The two finely dressed men exchanged a glance. Then, without a word, they turned and walked back toward the front door. Their departure was as quiet as their entrance, but the air they left behind was heavy, charged. The newcomer stood, glanced once at the woman, then at Lee. He nodded, a gesture that seemed to say more than words. Without another look, he helped the old man to his feet, supporting him with an arm, and guided him toward the back door. The woman followed them out. The room exhaled. People shifted back into their places, some relighting their pipes, others closing their eyes as if willing themselves to forget. Lee finally let go of my sleeve, but his voice was low and urgent. "You don't ask about this. Not here. Not outside. Not ever." I wanted to press him, wanted to know who those men were, why the old man mattered, but something in his tone made it clear I wouldn't get an answer. Not tonight. We stepped back out into the rain. The city was quieter now, the streets slick and glistening under the dim light of gas lamps. Somewhere, a phonograph played a tinny jazz tune, its notes drifting over the wet stone. Lee didn't speak as we walked. His face was set, eyes forward, as if replaying what had just happened in his mind. We turned down an alley lined with shuttered shops and stacks of empty baskets. I could hear the drip of water from the eaves, the distant clang of a bell from the river. Finally, I asked, "Do you know them?" He didn't look at me. "I know enough. Enough to be afraid." His jaw tightened. "Enough to stay alive." We walked in silence for a while longer. Then, just before we reached a wider street, he stopped and faced me. "If you want to see the real Shanghai, you have to understand something. It's not just the streets and buildings. It's the people who own them, the debts that tie them together. And some debts are paid in more than money." I thought about the old man, the way the woman in blue had stood her ground, the silent exchange between the two finely dressed men and the stranger in the heavy coat. It felt like I'd been given a glimpse of a much larger story, one I had no map for. We stepped out onto the main road, where rickshaws rattled past and shopkeepers pulled in their signs for the night. The city looked ordinary again, but I knew better now. Somewhere behind unmarked doors, other dens were breathing out their clouds of smoke, and behind those clouds were stories, quiet, dangerous, and hidden. Lee glanced over his shoulder, scanning the street before we moved on. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll take you to the French concession. Different world. Same shadows." And I couldn't tell if that was a promise or a warning. But I knew one thing for certain. I had just stepped into something that would not let me go. Not until I understood who those men were, and why the rain in Shanghai always seemed to carry the faint, inescapable scent of opium. And somewhere deep inside, I had the uneasy feeling that the next time I followed Lee into one of those hidden rooms, I might not walk out so easily. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the streets still wore its memory. Puddles reflected the tangle of telegraph wires above, and the air carried that post-storm freshness, though here in Shanghai, it was always tinged with the smell of coal smoke and damp stone. Lee was already waiting when I stepped out of my lodging, leaning against a lamppost with a cigarette balanced between his fingers. He didn't greet me with a smile. Lee rarely did, but he gave a short nod that meant we were on our way. We didn't take the main roads. Instead, he led me down side streets lined with hanging laundry, past noodle stalls where steam curled upward in fragrant clouds, and through markets where stallholders called out in a dozen different dialects. Even in the morning, the city moved with restless energy. Dock workers shouldered heavy crates, rickshaw runners darted between carriages, and beggars trailed behind businessmen, palms open in silent appeal. Our destination was the French concession, an enclave that seemed to follow its own set of rules. Here, the streets were wider, cleaner, and lined with plane trees whose branches made a dappled canopy overhead. Elegant townhouses stood behind wrought iron gates, their shutters freshly painted, their gardens neatly trimmed. The contrast with the Chinese districts was stark, quieter, calmer, yet somehow colder. Lee slowed his pace as we passed a cafe with polished brass fittings and lace curtains. Inside, European men in crisp suits sat at small tables, sipping coffee and reading newspapers. A phonograph played a slow waltz. I couldn't help but glance inside, but Lee kept moving. "We're not here for the coffee," he said without looking back. I asked where we were going. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took me around the back of a shuttered shop, through a courtyard with cracked tiles, and into a narrow lane where the noise of the main street faded away. At the far end stood a building that looked abandoned. Faded paint, boarded windows, a sagging roof. But as we approached, I noticed the faint hum of voices inside. We knocked twice, paused, and knocked once more, the same rhythm as the night before. The door creaked open to reveal a man in a well-cut suit, though his tie was loose and his hair slightly disheveled. He looked us over, said nothing, and stepped aside. Inside, the atmosphere was different from the previous den. The air was clearer, the light brighter, and the furnishings more deliberate. Lacquered tables, framed calligraphy, porcelain vases filled with fresh flowers. It didn't have the heavy, enclosed feeling of last night's place. But the scent was still there, faint but unmistakable. At the far end of the room, 3 men sat together, speaking in low voices. One of them I recognized instantly. It was the taller man from the night before. He saw me, and his expression flickered with something between recognition and suspicion. His gaze lingered, but he didn't speak. Lee led me to a small side room. A woman in a cheongsam of deep green silk was waiting there, her hair arranged in soft waves. She had the kind of beauty that seemed both timeless and deliberate, like she was aware of the effect she had on people. "This is Madame Sue," Lee said. Her smile was faint, polite. "So, you're the one who was watching last night." I hesitated. I didn't mean to intrude. "Oh, you did." Everyone who steps into a den knows they're entering a place where nothing is ever just what it seems. She gestured for me to sit. But sometimes curiosity is useful. There was something in her tone that suggested she had already decided I might be of use to her, though I had no idea how. She poured tea from a small pot into 2 cups, her movements precise. "The man you saw," she began, "the one the others came for, his name is Zhao. He's been part of this city longer than either of us has been alive. He knows things people would prefer to keep buried." I asked what kind of things. She sipped her tea before answering. "Names, dates, deals made in back rooms. Who owes money and who owes blood. That makes him valuable and dangerous." I thought back to the way the 2 men had walked into the den as if they owned it, and the way they'd left without a fight when the stranger in the heavy coat arrived. "And the man who took him away?" I asked. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "He's someone who collects debts of his own, and unlike most in this city, he doesn't care who he offends." Lee, who had been leaning against the wall, finally spoke. "We should go." But Madame Sue held up a hand. "No, let him hear this." She set down her cup. "In Shanghai, there are 3 kinds of people. Those who know nothing, those who know too much, and those who decide who gets to know anything at all. Last night, you moved from the first group to the second. You don't want to find yourself in the third." Her words hung in the air. Lee straightened. "Now we go," he said, more firmly this time. As we left, I glanced once more at the main room. The taller man was still watching me, his gaze steady, unreadable. I had the uneasy sense that whatever was happening in this city, I'd just been marked, not as a player, but as someone who might, sooner or later, be pulled into the game. Back outside, the sun had broken through the clouds, but it did nothing to lift the heaviness in my chest. Lee didn't speak for a long while. When he finally did, it was in that same low voice he'd used last night. "You see now why I told you not to ask questions?" "Yes," I said, but the truth was my questions had only multiplied. As we turned down another quiet lane, I realized something else. The scent of opium wasn't only in the dens. It clung to the clothes of those who carried its weight, to the very air the deals made in shadows. And no matter how far you walked, in Shanghai, there was always another door, another back room, another story waiting. The problem was, once you stepped through that door, you might not ever find your way back. And I had the distinct feeling that the next door Lee opened for me might be one I wouldn't want to walk through at all. That afternoon, the city seemed louder than usual, as if the noise itself was trying to push away the memory of the night before. Tram bells clanged along the French concession's wide streets. Street vendors shouted in rhythmic chants, and a phonograph somewhere played a scratchy rendition of a Parisian waltz. Yet beneath the surface, I felt the same tension, like Shanghai was a stage and the actors had all paused, waiting for the next cue. He didn't take me back toward the river this time. Instead, he led me inland, away from the main boulevards, weaving through a district where the buildings leaned over the narrow lanes, as if whispering secrets to each other. The air here was thicker, warmer, and carried the faint smell of fish from the markets. Above us, laundry flapped between buildings, casting fleeting shadows on the damp stones below. He stopped suddenly in front of a tailor's shop. From the street, it looked ordinary enough. Bolts of cloth stacked neatly in the window, a row of jackets hanging on a rail, and a tailor bent over his work inside. But when we stepped inside, the tailor didn't look up or greet him. Instead, he tapped twice on the counter, then slid a measuring tape aside to reveal a small brass key. Without a word, Lee took the key and led me through a door at the back of the shop. We descended a narrow staircase that smelled faintly of mildew. The deeper we went, the dimmer the light became, until the only illumination came from a single bare bulb swinging from the ceiling. At the bottom, the space opened into a low-ceilinged room lined with wooden benches. Men sat in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Their clothes were plain, but their eyes were sharp, scanning every movement. On a table in the center sat a large ceramic teapot and several chipped cups. The whole place felt like a meeting spot, not for friends, but for those who needed to talk where no one could overhear. Lee walked straight to a man sitting in the far corner. He was older, with a thin frame and hands that looked like they'd done delicate work for decades. His eyes were the color of worn leather, tired but still watchful. "This is Mr. Chun," Lee said. Chun didn't nod or smile. He simply studied me, as if deciding whether I was worth the effort of speaking to. Finally, he said, "You were in the den on Fuxing Road 2 nights ago." It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said carefully. "You saw them." Again, not a question. I nodded. Chun poured tea into a cup and slid it toward me. "Then you've already seen the edges of something. But the edges are the safest part. You can still walk away from there." I didn't touch the tea. "And the old man? Zhao, is he safe?" Chen's eyes flickered. Safe is a relative term in Shanghai. I was about to ask more, but he gave me a sharp glance that said not to push. Still, Chen leaned back in his chair and spoke as if deciding something aloud. "The opium dens are not just for escape. They're the city's back rooms. Deals are made there about ships, about cargo, about who gets to walk the streets without looking over their shoulder." Zhao knew too many of those deals. That's why they came for him. I asked about the man in the heavy coat, the one who had taken Zhao away without a fight. Chen's mouth curved in the faintest of smiles, though there was no humor in it. "Some call him the collector. He doesn't work for one side. He works for whoever can pay or whoever owes him. And debts in Shanghai." He let the sentence trail off, as if the rest didn't need to be said. Lee shifted in his seat, impatient. "We didn't come here for stories, Chun." Chen's gaze moved from Lee back to me. "If you want to understand this city, you have to see it for what it is, a web. Everyone is caught in it. Some are spiders, some are flies, and most don't know which they are until it's too late." The bulb above us swayed slightly, casting moving shadows across the walls. For a moment, the air in the room seemed heavier, as if the space itself didn't want certain words spoken too loudly. Lee stood. "We should go." I followed him up the narrow stairs, the smell of mildew giving way to the sharper scent of fabric dye as we re-entered the tailor's shop. Outside, the street noise felt jarring, almost unreal after the stillness below. We walked in silence for a while, the sound of our footsteps blending with the clatter of passing rickshaws. I wanted to ask while he was showing me all of this, why he hadn't just left me behind after that first night. But before I could, he stopped again, this time outside a small tea house with peeling red paint. Inside, the tea house was warm and dim, the air fragrant with jasmine. A few old men sat at low tables, playing cards. Li chose a corner table where we could see the door. You want to know why I'm showing you this? He said finally. Yes, I admitted. He leaned forward, his voice low. Because sooner or later, someone will notice you were in that room. They'll want to know what you saw. I'd rather you hear it from the people who can keep you alive than from the ones who can't. Before I could reply, the door opened, and a figure stepped inside. The woman in the pale blue robe from the den, the one who had stood between Zhao and the two men, walked in, her expression unreadable. She saw us instantly and crossed the room without hesitation. You, she said to me. It wasn't a greeting, more like a statement of recognition. I straightened in my seat. Yes. She glanced at Li, then back at me. Zhao wants to see you. The way she said it, I couldn't tell if it was an invitation or a summons. Li's eyes narrowed. Where? Her gaze stayed on me as she answered. Somewhere you've never been, and somewhere you won't forget. And just like that, I knew that whatever line I'd been walking on since that first night, I had just stepped over it. Some part of me wanted to refuse, to turn away before the city pulled me in any further. But another part, the part that had followed me into that first inn, knew I would go, even if I had no idea where the road would end. The woman in the pale blue robe didn't sit down. She stood at our table as though she had no intention of staying longer than necessary, her presence drawing the attention of the old men playing cards in the corner. Her calm, almost measured voice carried the kind of weight that made me feel like she was used to giving orders without ever raising her tone. Zhao isn't safe here, she said, her eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting someone to walk in at any moment. But he will speak with you. He says you need to understand something before the city decides what to do with you. That last part settled like a stone in my stomach. The city decides. In Shanghai, that didn't mean laws or courts. It meant people in shadowed rooms, people you'd never see coming until it was too late. Li leaned back in his chair, arms folded. And why would Zhao want to see him? She finally looked at him. Because he's new enough not to have taken sides, yet. I didn't know whether to take that as a warning or a compliment. But in her eyes, I thought I caught something else, urgency. We left the tea house together, the three of us stepping out into the brightness of late afternoon. The streets were crowded now, filled with a mix of rickshaw runners, women carrying baskets of vegetables, and foreign sailors heading toward the waterfront. A street musician plucked a sansien, the notes weaving faintly through the air, but the sound seemed far away. My mind was on Zhao. I'd only seen him for a few moments, yet there had been something about him, a stillness in his gaze that suggested he'd seen the city change in ways I couldn't imagine. If what Madame Su and Chun had said was true, Zhao was more than just another patron in an opium den. He was a piece of the city's memory, and that made him dangerous. We turned off the main road into a quieter lane, where the sound of the crowd faded behind us. Here, the buildings were older, their walls streaked with years of rain. The woman led us toward a small gate half hidden by climbing vines. She knocked in a slow, deliberate rhythm, different from the one Li had used before. The gate creaked open to reveal a courtyard. The air inside was cooler, shaded by an old camphor tree whose branches spread wide over the tiled roofs. In the center, a narrow path led to a low building with sliding wooden doors. The faint scent of incense drifted on the air. We stepped inside, leaving the noise of the city completely behind. The room was dim but clean, with tatami mats on the floor and shelves lined with tea jars. In the far corner, seated on a cushion, was Zhao. He looked older in the daylight, his skin drawn tight over sharp cheekbones, his eyes deep-set but alert. He didn't speak right away. He gestured for us to sit. The woman poured tea without asking if we wanted it, her movements practiced and silent. When Zhao finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. You've seen enough to know the city isn't what it pretends to be, but you haven't seen enough to know what it really is. I wasn't sure how to answer. He seemed to study my hesitation, as if weighing whether I could handle the rest of what he might say. Shanghai has always been a city of doors, he continued. Some lead to money, some to ruin, and some to rooms you can never leave. The opium dens, they are more than escape. They're gathering places for the ones who decide what this city becomes. They sit on both sides, foreign and Chinese, and they use the smoke to make people talk. to make them forget what they've promised, or to make them remember debts they owe. He paused to sip his tea. The men who came for me were sent by one of the foreign houses. They think I still hold certain records from the years after the war. Names of those who moved goods through the port without paying the right people. They're not wrong, but the records aren't here. The woman in blue glanced at him sharply, as if he'd said too much. Zhao's eyes didn't leave mine. The collector, he works for no one, but he can be hired by anyone. He took me because he knows the value of what I remember, and because there are people who would rather see me disappear quietly than risk me speaking. I thought about the two men in the den, the way they had left without a word when the collector arrived. That kind of silent retreat wasn't fear, it was recognition. Why tell me this? I asked. Because you've already stepped into the river, Zhao said simply. It's better to swim than to pretend you can get back to the shore. Before I could ask what that meant, the sound of a distant bell rang through the courtyard. It was faint, but Zhao's expression changed immediately. The woman set her teacup down, her movements suddenly brisk. They found us, she said quietly. Li was already standing, scanning the room for another way out. Zhao remained seated, his calm almost unnerving. Go through the back, he told us. Take the lane by the river. If you're stopped, you didn't see me. The woman placed a hand on his shoulder, but he shook his head. Go. There was no time to argue. Li grabbed my arm, pulling me toward a side door that led into a narrow corridor smelling faintly of damp wood. We slipped through a small gate into another alley, the sound of the city returning in layers, footsteps, shouts, the creak of cartwheels. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Li glanced back toward the way we'd come. You see now? This isn't about the opium. It's about the people who use it as a curtain. I thought of Zhao sitting in that quiet room, the camphor tree swaying above him, and wondered what would happen to him now. But Li was already moving again, and the lane ahead of us seemed darker than before, as if the city itself had drawn the shadows closer. Somewhere behind us, I thought I heard the faint sound of sliding doors and hurried footsteps. But when I turned, there was only the empty curve of the alley. We kept walking, and with every step, I had the feeling that whatever was waiting ahead would make the events of the last 2 nights seem like the calm before a storm. The rain had finally stopped, but the streets of Shanghai still glistened under the dim light of gas lamps, their reflections trembling in shallow puddles. The smell of wet stone and coal smoke lingered in the air, mingling with something sweeter, more intoxicating, a faint trace of opium drifting from behind shuttered doors. Li Wei walked slowly, his leather shoes clicking softly on the slick cobblestones. He was not in a hurry. In this part of the city, moving too fast drew attention. And attention, especially at this hour, was never a good thing. On either side of the street, shop fronts sat closed, their wooden panels shut tight. Above them, laundry lines still hung between the upper floors of the buildings, clothes dripping from the earlier downpour. Somewhere in the distance, a lone rickshaw creaked along, the driver's sandals splashing through the water. The night felt heavy with silence, yet Li Wei knew that behind the walls around him, life was still humming, life of a different sort. He turned down a narrow lane barely wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. The lantern here burned low, casting more shadow than light. This was where Old Zhang had told him to go. He could still hear Zhang's warning from earlier that evening, given in a hushed tone over a chipped porcelain teacup. You will see things, Zhang had said, things the newspapers never speak of and the police pretend not to notice. But keep your mouth shut and your eyes sharper than your tongue. The lane opened into a small courtyard, its center dominated by a gnarled tree whose roots had long cracked the stone tiles. A faint sound of music drifted from a side door. A melody played on the eru, slow and mournful. Li Wei paused, letting the notes wash over him. It was not the music of celebration, but of longing, a sound that belonged to another time. Then came the other smell, stronger now, the unmistakable, thick sweetness of opium smoke. He stepped toward the door, its red paint chipped and faded, the carved dragon motifs worn smooth from decades of use. Inside, the room was dim, lit only by a handful of oil lamps. Smoke curled lazily in the air, catching the light in pale ribbons. Men lay sprawled on low wooden couches, their heads resting on hard pillows carved from lacquered wood, their faces slack with half-conscious bliss. Beside them, brass pipes gleamed, their long stems reaching toward porcelain bowls filled with dark, sticky resin. No one looked up when Li Wei entered. This was not a place for greetings or chatter. Here, the world narrowed to the pipe, the flame, and the next inhalation. A woman in a deep green Chong Sam moved silently between the couches, her hair pinned high with a single silver ornament. She glanced at Li Wei just once, her expression unreadable, then disappeared through a curtain at the back. He found a seat near the corner, not too close to the others, but with a view of the whole room. The furniture was old but sturdy, its wood polished smooth by years of use. From this vantage point, he could see more than just the customers. He noticed the small exchanges, a slip of paper handed discreetly from one man to another, a folded note hidden inside a teacup before it was carried away. It was not just smoke being traded here. In the far corner, an elderly man sat upright, his hands resting on a cane. His eyes, sharp despite his years, followed every movement in the room. Li Wei had seen him before, though never in a place like this. People called him Uncle Luo, and while no one seemed to know his exact business, everyone knew better than to cross him. Uncle Luo was the sort who spoke softly but could summon trouble with a single gesture. Their eyes met briefly, and in that instant, Li Wei felt as though the old man could see straight through him, peeling back every thought he had ever tried to hide. Then Luo looked away, raising a pipe to his lips with the slow precision of someone who had all the time in the world. From behind the curtain, the woman in green returned, carrying a small wooden tray. On it were 3 small porcelain bowls and a tiny oil lamp. She set them down beside a man with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. Without a word, she prepared the pipe for him, the ritual careful and deliberate. Li Wei watched the man exhale, the smoke drifting upward in slow spirals. The expression on his face shifted, relief, perhaps, or something deeper, something darker. Li Wei's mind wandered to the stories old Zhang had told him, how these dens were once the hidden heartbeat of Shanghai's underworld, where deals were struck, debts were settled, and fortunes quietly changed hands. The foreign merchants had brought opium here decades ago, but the city had made it its own, twisting it into something that was no longer just a vice, but a currency, a language, a weapon. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, breaking the quiet hum of the room. The man in the wide-brimmed hat shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the inside of his coat. Li Wei noticed the movement, but before he could dwell on it, the woman in green caught his gaze again, holding it just a moment too long. There was something in her eyes, not a warning exactly, but not an invitation either. More like a question. The Yeru's music faded, replaced by the soft sound of rain beginning again outside. The air in the den grew thicker, the lamps dimmer. Li Wei leaned back, unsure if he had come here seeking answers, or if he had simply stepped into a place designed to make you forget the questions entirely. Somewhere in the haze, Uncle Luo tapped his cane twice on the floor. The sound was soft but carried through the room like a signal. 2 men rose from their couches and disappeared through the curtain at the back, leaving their pipes behind. Li Wei felt the air shift. Whatever was happening beyond that curtain was not for just anyone to see. He thought of leaving, of stepping back into the rain and putting the night behind him. But then he remembered Zhang's voice, the warning, the promise of things worth knowing, things hidden in places like this. And so he stayed, waiting, the smoke curling around him, the faint taste of opium in the air, and the sense that the night had only just begun to show its true shape. By now, the lamps along the bund were glowing faintly in the dusk, and the air along the waterfront had changed. The day's sharp smells of salt, coal smoke, and fish had softened into something cooler and heavier. That was when Li Wei noticed something unusual. 2 men in immaculate suits, speaking in low voices as they leaned on the rail of the promenade, their eyes never resting on the river, but instead drifting toward the alleyways behind them. They didn't seem to belong to the evening crowd of lovers, porters, or rickshaw pullers. They were 2 still, too deliberate, as though they were listening for a sound only they could hear. One of them tapped a gold-tipped cane on the stone at regular intervals, like a signal. Lewin slowed his pace, though he knew better than to stare. The bund was alive with contrasts. European bankers hurrying toward their clubs, barefoot boys running deliveries, sailors shouting over the sound of water slapping the hulls of moored ships. But just a few streets inland, the light changed again, the noises softened, and the scents thickened. There, amid a tangle of lanes and crumbling facades, was where the true heart of Old Shanghai pulsed, hidden from the casual visitor. That was where the opium dens lived, breathing in rhythm with the city itself. In the quieter streets, the air held a faint, sweet tang. The smell seemed to cling to the old plaster walls, to seep out from behind closed wooden shutters. People walked a little slower here, as if the pace of the city had shifted. Lewin passed a doorway draped with heavy red cloth. A man emerged, blinking against the dimness, his movements loose and unfocused. He smiled vaguely at nothing in particular, his gaze sliding past Lewin as though he were already halfway elsewhere. Then the curtain dropped again, hiding whatever lay inside. Lewin remembered his father's warnings about such places. "They'll take the silver from your pocket and the years from your life," he had said. But his father had also been the one who told stories of the city's hidden underbelly, of the men who ran the trade, the foreign merchants who quietly profited, and the policemen who pretended not to see. Lewin had always listened more closely to those stories than his father realized. Now, walking through these streets as night thickened, he could feel those stories pressing against the present moment. The lane bent sharply and opened into a small courtyard lit by a single lantern swinging gently in the evening breeze. It cast long shadows across uneven cobblestones. In the corner, a boy of no more than 12 sat cross-legged, weaving thin bamboo strips into a basket. He glanced up, studied Lewin for a moment, then returned to his work without a word. But Lewin felt certain that the boy was aware of everything, every footstep, every whispered conversation. The city was full of such silent observers, invisible to those who didn't know how to look. Somewhere deeper in the maze of alleys, the sound of music floated out, a low, mournful tune plucked on a pipa. It was almost swallowed by the soft murmur of voices. Lewin followed the sound, his feet moving of their own accord, until he reached a doorway painted black, its surface worn smooth by years of passing hands. Above it, a faded sign bore Chinese characters so weathered they were almost unreadable. No one stood outside, but he felt watched all the same. He stepped closer, and the scent of burning opium grew stronger, mingled with incense and the faintest note of something metallic. The air here was different, thicker, warmer, as if the walls themselves were exhaling. He didn't enter, but he lingered long enough to catch a glimpse when someone inside shifted the curtain. He saw a dim room, its corners swallowed in shadow, where figures reclined on low wooden couches. The smoke curled in lazy spirals, catching the lamplight, and for a moment, time seemed to move differently within those walls. Just then, footsteps approached from behind. Lewin turned to see an older man, tall and thin, dressed in a simple gray changshan. His eyes were sharp and direct. Without introduction, he said, "If you're looking for stories, this is not the place to begin. You'll lose your way before you find your answer." Then he stepped past Lewin, ducked inside, and was gone. The curtain fell shut, and the music faded again into the city's heartbeat. Lewin stood there for a moment longer, unsure if the man's words were warning or invitation. The street felt heavier now, as though it had noticed him more than he intended. Somewhere in the distance, the gold-tipped cane tapped against stone again, and the sound echoed faintly in the narrow space between the walls. He thought of turning back toward the bund, toward the open air and the safer light, but something in him resisted. The city had already begun its quiet pull, and he knew that once Shanghai chose to draw someone in, there was no easy way out. As he moved deeper into the winding streets, the people around him changed. There were fewer hurried steps, more eyes half-lidded, more voices dropping into murmurs. A pair of rickshaws stood unattended, their pullers nowhere in sight. Above, laundry hung motionless in the still night air, the fabric glowing faintly in the light of distant lanterns. Somewhere nearby, a door creaked open, then shut again quickly, as if to let out just enough sound to remind the listener it existed. Li Wen's path narrowed until it became little more than a passage between two leaning buildings. He pressed on, his shoulder brushing the wall, and emerged into another small square, this one lit only by the moon. In the center stood an old stone well, its edge worn smooth by decades of hands drawing water. A black cat sat on the rim, watching him with unblinking eyes. The animal didn't move as he passed, only followed him with its gaze, as though regarding something he could not yet see. The air here felt colder, despite the enclosed space. He thought again of the two men on the bund, of the boy with the bamboo strips, of the man in gray who had vanished into the black-doored building. They were like pieces of a puzzle he hadn't yet learned to assemble. Somewhere in these streets was the truth about the opium dens, how they had become so woven into Shanghai's fabric that they could not be erased without tearing the city itself. But truth here was not given. It had to be earned, and perhaps stolen. From far away, he heard the sound of a bell, deep, slow, deliberate. It might have been from a temple, or it might have been something else entirely. Either way, it made the shadows feel longer and the streets feel older. He took one more step forward, and the sound of a door opening reached him. Light spilled briefly into the square, along with the shape of a figure silhouetted in the doorway. Then the light vanished, and the square was silent again. Li Wen was no longer sure whether he was moving toward an answer or deeper into the city's labyrinth, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stop now. Somewhere ahead, the heart of Old Shanghai was waiting, and with it, the stories no one dared to speak aloud. The sound of the river outside drifted into the narrow streets as if it carried secrets from far-off places. You could smell the briny air mixed with coal smoke from steamboats, and somewhere in the distance, the faint notes of a Chinese eru rose and fell like the tide. In these hours before dawn, Shanghai was caught between two worlds, half awake, half dreaming. The foreign settlement near the bund still glowed faintly under the gas lamps, its stone buildings standing in stark contrast to the wooden shop houses of the old Chinese quarters. Here, in the winding lanes south of the river, life pulsed with a rhythm that belonged to neither east nor west, but something in between. It was in these twisting alleyways that the opium dens hid, tucked behind plain wooden doors and shadowed windows. By day, they looked like any other shop or storeroom. But by night, the lanterns inside burned low and warm, and the air thickened with the scent of burning poppy resin. To an outsider, the smell was strange, almost bittersweet, like dried flowers left too long in a dusty jar. To those who came often, it was the smell of escape. The owners of these dens rarely spoke much. They moved quietly, tending to customers as if the world outside didn't exist. Some were old men with hands rough from years of work before the opium trade took over their lives. Others were sharp-eyed women who knew how to read a man's mood the moment he stepped through the door. They knew when he needed quiet, and when he needed someone to lean close and whisper something soft enough to make the smoke taste sweeter. Not everyone who came here was the same. There were dock workers who saved their coins for a small pipe at the end of a long week. There were merchants in silk robes, slipping away from business dinners to lose themselves for a few hours. There were foreigners, too, sailors, traders, and wanderers, drawn in by the stories they'd heard in far-off ports. Many arrived curious. Some left changed. Others never left at all. Lu Ming had grown up in these streets, and he knew them the way a fisherman knows the shifting moods of the sea. He could tell by the footsteps behind him if someone was lost or simply walking home. He could sense when trouble was near, even before it showed its face. Tonight, he moved with the ease of someone who belonged, but his eyes were sharper than usual. Something about the air felt different. He passed a tea shop where the last customers of the night were playing cards, their laughter spilling into the street. A cat darted between two barrels, its fur brushing his ankle before disappearing into the shadows. Ahead, an old wooden sign swung gently from a chain, its painted characters faded from years of weather. Behind that door, he knew, was the Lotus House, one of the oldest opium dens in this part of the city. It had been here longer than most of the foreigners who claimed to know Shanghai's ways, and older than the young policemen who patrolled the edges of these neighborhoods, but rarely dared to step inside. Ming had no intention of smoking tonight. His visits were different now. He came to listen, to watch, and to catch the threads of conversations that others overlooked. He wasn't sure exactly what he was looking for, only that the pieces of story were scattered here, and if he stayed long enough, he might be able to gather them. Inside, the Lotus House was dimly lit, its wooden walls stained dark with age. The smell of incense mingled with the heavier scent of opium smoke, curling upward in thin spirals. Cushioned benches lined the walls, each occupied by men reclining with half-closed eyes. Some spoke in murmurs, others drifted in silence, their minds far from the room. A young woman moved between them, refilling pipes, her long braid swaying behind her like a metronome to the slow rhythm of the night. Ming took a seat near the back, where he could see both the door and the low counter where the den's keeper sat. The keeper was a man in his 50s, his face weathered but his gaze sharp. He recognized Ming with a nod, but didn't speak. Words were rarely exchanged here unless necessary. In the far corner, two men spoke softly in English, their accents not quite British but not American either. Ming couldn't place them exactly, but he could tell from their tailored jackets and polished shoes that they were not sailors. They kept glancing toward the door, as if waiting for someone. Ming's ear caught fragments, shipment, delay, price, but the rest was lost beneath the quiet hum of the room. Then the door opened, letting in a slice of cooler night air. A tall man in a dark coat stepped inside. His hair was neatly combed, and his eyes scanned the room quickly before settling on the two men in the corner. The three exchanged a look that was more than a greeting. It was recognition, and perhaps a signal. The keeper didn't move, but Ming noticed the way his fingers drummed softly against the counter, as if counting something invisible. Outside, the city was slowly waking. Somewhere down the street, a rooster crowed. But inside the Lotus House, time seemed to hold still, as if the night was reluctant to let go. Ming stayed where he was, his gaze steady, the weight of curiosity pressing against him like the damp air. Whatever was unfolding here tonight was more than just another meeting between men with money to spend. He leaned back, letting the smoke drift around him, and tried to look like just another tired man with no place better to be. But his mind was alert, tracing possibilities, wondering why men like these would choose a place like this for their talks. And more than that, he wondered how long it would be before the calm of the room broke, and what might happen when it did. The rain had begun again, a slow, misty drizzle that blurred the lamplight and made the air smell of damp stone and distant sea. Samuel stood under the awning of a tea house, watching the street breathe with life in its own strange rhythm. Somewhere in the crowd, the quiet eyes of a man or woman were on him. He could feel it. It wasn't paranoia. Not here. Not in Shanghai's underbelly, where curiosity could be fatal. He had learned enough in just a few weeks to know that nothing in this city moved without reason. Down the alley to his right, a narrow canal reflected a sickly light. Boats moved silently, their oars barely making a sound. A thin haze drifted along the water, the kind that clung to your clothes and hair, making the night feel heavier than it should. He could hear muffled laughter from somewhere nearby, the kind of laughter that came from behind shuttered doors and painted screens. This part of the city was waking up. Inside the tea house behind him, a game of mahjong clinked and snapped with sharp, rhythmic sounds. The air was thick with steam and the sharp, earthy scent of oolong. A young waitress moved between tables, her voice low, her hands careful not to spill a drop from the ceramic teapot she carried. No one looked directly at Samuel, but he knew they were aware of him. The foreigner who wandered too far into streets that didn't welcome strangers. The outsider who asked the wrong questions in the wrong places. He had spent the last few days piecing together fragments, whispers from dock workers, coded stories from rickshaw drivers, even a few hints from old sailors who claimed to have seen the dens with their own eyes. The picture forming in his mind was incomplete, like a painting left in shadows. The opium dens weren't just hidden. They were guarded, woven into the fabric of the city's economy, politics, and fears. Samuel remembered the words of a retired policeman he had met near the Bund 2 nights before. The man had been reluctant to speak, but a bottle of cheap rice wine had loosened his tongue. You think the dens are just rooms with smoke and pillows? No, they're doors. And once you go through, you can't come back. The man hadn't explained further, but his eyes had the haunted look of someone who had seen what lay beyond. As Samuel crossed the street toward another alley, he caught sight of a figure leaning against the wall, half hidden in the shadows. The man was older, wearing a cap pulled low and a coat that looked a size too large. When Samuel approached, the man stepped forward just enough to be seen. His face was lined, his eyes small and calculating. "You're looking for a place you shouldn't," the man said, his Mandarin clipped and low. "It's not for people like you." Samuel didn't answer right away. He had learned that silence in these conversations was as valuable as gold. The man glanced down the alley, then back at Samuel. "But maybe you can pay." His tone shifted, less warning, more transaction. "There's a tea shop near the fish market. Ask for the midnight room. If they let you in, you'll see." Before Samuel could ask a question, the man melted into the mist, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The fish market was across the district, and Samuel made his way there slowly, avoiding the main roads. He passed noodle stalls where steam clouded the air and butchers chopping meat with heavy cleavers. Somewhere above, laundry swayed between windows, dripping from the rain. The smell of dried fish and salt water grew stronger as he approached the market, along with the faint, metallic tang of the river. The tea shop was exactly where the man had said it would be, small, with no sign, its doorway almost hidden behind crates of seafood. Inside, the walls were stained from years of steam and smoke, and a single lantern hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly. A middle-aged woman stood behind the counter, her eyes scanning Samuel with a quick flicker of curiosity. "I'm looking for the midnight room," Samuel said quietly. She didn't answer at first. Then she nodded toward a curtain at the back. "Wait there." Minutes passed. The only sound was the slow drip of water from somewhere near the doorway. Then the woman returned and lifted the curtain. "Follow me." The hallway beyond was narrow, with low ceilings and wooden floors that creaked underfoot. Samuel followed her through 2 turns, down a short flight of steps, and into a room lit only by a single candle. He smelled it before he saw it, the thick, sweet scent that clung to everything. There were no tables here, no teacups, just a row of low couches and a haze that softened the edges of the room. Shadows moved in the corners, people reclining, their faces half hidden, their eyes half closed. But this wasn't the full den, not yet. The woman looked at him once, as if deciding whether he should go further. "You can sit," she said, "or you can keep walking. Past here, you see things you can't forget." Samuel hesitated, the air heavy around him. Somewhere behind a closed door, he heard the faint sound of a string instrument, slow and mournful. A voice spoke in a language he didn't know, followed by laughter that didn't sound entirely human. His pulse quickened. He knew that if he stepped forward, he'd be crossing into the world he had been chasing since his first day in Shanghai. The world people spoke of only in whispers if they spoke at all. And somewhere in that world, hidden in the smoke and shadows, was the truth he had been looking for. But the question was, would he recognize it when he found it? The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened under the faint glow of lanterns swinging in the night breeze. June pressed deeper into the shadows, his coat collar pulled high. Somewhere beyond the quiet alleys, the sound of footsteps echoed, steady, deliberate, as if whoever it was knew exactly where he was going. June's mind returned to that brief moment in the den earlier, when the pale man with the inked dragon on his wrist had looked at him without saying a word. It was not a look of curiosity or suspicion. It was the look of someone who knew him, or at least knew why he was there. That look had lodged in his mind like a splinter. He passed a shuttered tea shop, its sign hanging loose on one rusted hinge, and ducked into the narrow gap between two brick walls. This was not the main road back to the foreign settlement. It was the back way, the one only locals used, the one where the buildings leaned so close together it felt like the street might collapse in on itself. He had not planned on taking this route tonight, but something told him it was safer than staying in the open. The air was thick here, damp with the smell of coal smoke and river mud. June's footsteps barely made a sound on the wet stones, but somewhere ahead, a faint tapping echoed, a rhythm, like a cane striking the ground at measured intervals. He slowed. The tapping stopped. For a long moment, there was only the drip of water from the rooftops, and then the sound returned, closer now. He pressed his back to the wall and held his breath. A figure emerged from the fog. Not tall, but moving with a kind of confidence that made the space feel even smaller. The man wore a wide-brimmed hat, its edges wet and shining, and a long coat that nearly touched the ground. As he passed, June caught the faint scent of opium smoke clinging to him, a reminder that even here, far from the dens, the trade's reach was everywhere. June waited until the sound faded before moving again. His path took him past a small noodle stall, where the owner had fallen asleep with his head on the counter, the faint steam from the soup pot curling into the air. It was a comforting sight in a night otherwise filled with unease. He paused there, letting the quiet lull him for a moment, until he noticed something, a folded slip of paper barely visible under the edge of the soup bowl. He pulled it free. The writing was hurried, the strokes uneven. Not all debts are paid in silver. June frowned. It could have been nothing, just some forgotten scrap. But the words tugged at something in the back of his mind. The opium dens thrived on debts, not just of money, but of loyalty, of silence, of lives promised away. He tucked the note into his pocket and walked on, feeling the weight of the words settle on him. By the time he reached the Bund, the river was cloaked in a thin mist. Cargo boats bobbed gently, their crews huddled in shadows. Even here, far from the narrow streets, the city never truly slept. Somewhere in the haze, he could hear the low whistle of a steamship, followed by the distant laughter of sailors spilling out of a riverside bar. But June was not heading for warmth or company. He made for a warehouse whose door was marked with a faded character for peace and irony, given what was stored inside. The man waiting there was older, his hands rough from years of hauling crates, but his eyes were sharp. He said nothing as June entered, simply bolted the door behind them. Inside, the air was cooler, the stone floor lined with crates stacked higher than a man's head. Some were marked as tea, others as textiles, but June knew better. He had seen enough to recognize the signs. Faint traces of resin around the edges, the lingering scent beneath the layers of burlap. This was where shipments came before they were divided, before they slipped into the city's veins. The older man handed June a ledger, its pages worn and smudged. The entries were coded, but not enough to hide their meaning from someone who knew what to look for. Dates, amounts, destinations. The flow of opium through the city was here, reduced to neat lines of ink. But one section caught his eye. 3 crates sent to a destination simply listed as Lotus. No address, no street, just a name. June had heard that name before. It was whispered in certain circles, always with caution. Some said it was a person, others claimed it was a place, perhaps another den, one more secretive than the rest. But there were also those who insisted it was neither, that it was something else entirely. Before he could ask, the older man shook his head. "Don't follow that trail," he said quietly. "It doesn't come back." June closed the ledger, but the warning only deepened his resolve. He knew enough to be cautious, but he also knew that walking away now would haunt him. Every opium pipe he had seen tonight, every cloud of smoke curling upward from those shadowed rooms, seemed to point toward that word. Lotus. He left the warehouse and stepped back into the mist. The city felt different now, heavier, as though the streets themselves were leaning in to listen. Somewhere out, there was the answer, and maybe the danger that came with it. But for now, all he could do was follow the trail, one careful step at a time, knowing that the next door he opened might change everything. The narrow lanes of the old city seemed to twist in on themselves, as if they were hiding something at the heart of their maze. The further one walked, the more the noise of the outer streets faded, replaced by muffled voices, the clink of porcelain cups, and the faint scratch of a string instrument from somewhere unseen. By now, even the air felt heavier. There was a scent lingering here, faintly floral, faintly medicinal, that seemed to cling to the walls themselves. May had once told me that in this part of Shanghai, scents could outlast the people who created them. By the late afternoon, the streets began to change. Shops gave way to dim doorways where velvet curtains hung, half concealing what lay beyond. Outside, a few men loitered with the stillness of statues, their eyes following each passerby without a flicker of expression. I kept my head down, trying not to look as curious as I felt. It wasn't easy. Every detail seemed to tug at my attention. The way one door frame was worn smooth from countless hands pushing it open, or the strange carvings on the stone steps leading up to a second-floor room that glowed faintly from within. Liang walked just ahead of me, his pace neither hurried nor slow. He didn't speak, but I could sense the care in the way he chose our path. It was as if he were threading a needle through this district, weaving us around certain corners and through narrow alleys where shadows seemed to pool like ink. We stopped outside a building that looked unremarkable at first. 3 stories, wooden shutters, peeling paint, but the air here was different. Liang turned to me. Inside, don't speak unless you have to. Watch more than you talk. And if anyone asks who you are, tell them you're with me. I nodded, my pulse picking up as we stepped inside. The transition from street to interior was like walking into another world. The light was dim, filtered through layers of gauze and smoke. A low hum filled the air, not from voices but from the quiet life of the room itself. The shuffle of cards, the pour of tea, the faint hiss of a pipe being lit somewhere, just out of sight. My eyes adjusted slowly, shapes emerging from the haze. Men and women reclining on narrow couches, their faces calm but their eyes unfocused. A servant moved silently between them, carrying a tray with cups no bigger than thimbles. We crossed the room, Liang leading us toward the back where a beaded curtain swayed gently, as if stirred by a hidden breeze. Beyond it, the atmosphere shifted again. The main room was quieter, more intimate. Here, there were fewer people, but they seemed more alert. Conversations paused as we entered, eyes tracking us briefly before returning to their own matters. In the corner sat a woman in a pale green silk cheongsam, her hair pinned with a single jade comb. She looked no older than 40, but there was something in her posture, measured, deliberate, that made it clear she was not to be underestimated. Liang greeted her with a small bow. "Madame Hua," he said softly, "I've brought someone who needs to understand." Her gaze moved to me, sharp but not unkind. Understand what, exactly? Before I could answer, Liang spoke again. The truth about this place. The truth they won't find in newspapers or in the mouths of those who pretend to know. She studied me for a moment longer, then gestured for us to sit. The cushions were soft, the table between us set with a pot of tea that smelled faintly of jasmine. She poured 3 cups without asking if we wanted any, sliding one toward me. "You've walked through streets that remember more than most people alive," she began. "But the stories of these streets, they're not told in daylight." I took a cautious sip of tea, the warmth grounding me as she spoke. She told me of the early days, when Shanghai's port had first opened to the world and traders brought with them not just goods, but vices. The opium dens had started small, hidden behind respectable shop fronts, but they grew quickly. By the time most people realized what was happening, they were already part of the city's rhythm. It wasn't just smoke, she said. It was escape. It was dreams that could be bought and sold. Liang listened silently, his eyes fixed on her as if each word she spoke carried weight. I began to understand that this wasn't simply history. It was something personal to him. "Madam," Hua's voice lowered. "But there's another story. One you won't hear from the guides or the old men in tea shops. There were people who used these places for more than just pleasure. Deals were made in these rooms. Secrets traded like coins. And some of those secrets still matter." I leaned forward slightly. Secrets about what? Her smile was faint, almost apologetic. You're not ready to hear that yet. The beaded curtain behind us rattled softly, and a man stepped into the room. His suit was perfectly pressed, his hair neatly combed, but his eyes carried a sharpness that made the air feel suddenly thinner. He nodded politely to Madame Hua, glanced at Liang, and then let his gaze rest on me for a moment longer than was comfortable. You brought someone new, he said. His voice was calm, but I could feel the question beneath it. Liang's answer was steady. They're here to listen. The man's expression didn't change, but his tone softened just slightly. Then they should understand, listening is not the same as knowing. I had the sense that something unspoken had just passed between him and Liang, something I wasn't meant to catch. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was about me. Madame Hua refilled our cups, her movements unhurried. You'll learn what you need to, she said, almost to herself, but only if you're careful enough to survive the learning. Somewhere in the main room beyond the curtain, a string instrument began to play again, slow, almost mournful. The sound seemed to seep into the air around us, wrapping the moment in something both beautiful and uneasy. I didn't know exactly what I'd stepped into, but I was certain of one thing. This was only the beginning, and the real story was still waiting in the shadows. The rain had slowed to a mist, but the streets of Shanghai glistened as though they still held the memory of a downpour. Under the dim light of paper lanterns, figures moved like shadows, slipping between doorways and ducking beneath awnings, their heads low as if trying to hide from more than just the weather. The air was heavy with a strange perfume, part incense, part tobacco, and something deeper, something that clung to the back of the throat and made the mind feel both curious and cautious. May's footsteps echoed faintly on the wet stone as she followed the narrow alley toward the bund. Her heart was racing, though she forced herself to look calm. Mr. Liang had told her the first rule of Shanghai was simple. If you looked lost, you became someone else's business. And in this part of the city, you didn't want to be anyone's business. She kept walking, her fingers brushing the inside of her coat where the folded paper note rested. The words on it were in delicate calligraphy, an invitation of sorts, though she wasn't certain if it was to a conversation, a warning, or a trap. Somewhere up ahead, the muffled sound of music drifted through the mist. It wasn't the lively swing that played in the foreigners' clubs, but something slower, almost mournful, the kind of melody that seemed to carry its own memories. The closer she got, the more she could hear the occasional bursts of laughter, followed by moments of silence that felt deliberate. May had never been inside an opium den, but she had heard the stories since she was a child. The way people spoke about them depended entirely on who you asked. Some spoke of them as exotic and romantic, places where the troubles of the world dissolved into sweet smoke and quiet dreams. Others spoke of them like traps that once entered could never be truly escaped. As she turned the corner, she saw it. A two-story wooden building with ornate carvings that were fading under peeling paint. Red lanterns swayed faintly in the wind, casting uneven light across the entrance. Two men stood outside, their faces unreadable, their eyes moving over her with the detached sharpness of people who missed nothing. She met their gaze for only a moment before looking away, just as Mr. Liang had advised. Show interest, and you were marked. Show fear, and you were weak. But walk like you belong, and the city might just let you pass through unnoticed. Inside, the air was thicker than she expected. The smoke curled in languid patterns, carrying with it a faint sweetness. Wooden dividers separated low tables, each draped in faded silk. People lay reclined on couches, their expressions distant, their conversations quiet, as though every word was precious and should not be wasted. Some were foreign sailors in weathered coats. Others were local merchants with rings glinting on their fingers. A few looked like they had come straight from the theater, still wearing heavy stage makeup that made their eyes seem too large for their faces. In the corner, a man with silver hair and a silk robe was speaking in low tones to someone May couldn't see. Every so often, he would tap the long pipe in his hand against the table, the faint sound carrying through the haze. She couldn't explain why, but she had the feeling he was the one she had come here to find. Mr. Liang had told her she might not get a second chance, so she needed to be ready to act when the moment came. But she didn't move toward him yet. Instead, she slid into an empty space near the back, letting her eyes adjust, letting herself become part of the background. From here, she could listen without being noticed. The conversations that floated to her were fragmented. Talk of a shipment that had arrived early, whispers about a new police crackdown, laughter about some foreign journalist who had been caught asking the wrong questions. It was the kind of place where news and gossip mixed freely, and where truth and lies were nearly impossible to tell apart. The longer she sat there, the more she felt the tension beneath the stillness. It was in the way the staff moved quickly but without rushing, in the way some guests glanced at the door too often, and in the faint hum of something unspoken lingering in the room. Everyone here seemed to be waiting. For what? She didn't yet know. Then she noticed something odd. A young man at a nearby table, perhaps no older than 20, kept glancing toward the silver-haired man in the corner. His expression was sharp, too alert for someone who had come here to lose himself in smoke. When their eyes met for just an instant, May saw it, that same flicker of recognition she had seen once before in an entirely different part of the city. It was a look that said he knew she wasn't here by accident. Before she could decide what to do, the silver-haired man stood. The room seemed to shift as he walked toward a door in the back. Without a word, the young man rose as well, following at a distance. May knew she had a choice: stay here in the safety of the shadows, or step into the path of something she didn't yet understand. She took a deep breath, felt the weight of the folded note in her pocket, and stood. The smoke swirled around her as she moved toward the back, her footsteps quiet but steady. Somewhere beyond that door, the true heart of the den, and perhaps the real reason she had been sent here, was waiting. But just as her hand touched the edge of the doorframe, she felt a light tap on her shoulder. She turned, half expecting to see the young man or one of the doormen, but instead found herself staring into the face of someone she had not seen in years. Someone who, the last time she had heard, had disappeared from Shanghai entirely. And the look in their eyes told her that whatever lay beyond that door was not just dangerous. It was the beginning of something far bigger than the opium dens, something that might change everything she thought she knew about this city. The night air was heavy now, pressing down on the streets like a damp blanket. Somewhere in the distance, a lone ship's horn echoed along the Huangpu River, deep and mournful, as if the city itself was sighing. May quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder. The narrow lane seemed even darker tonight, the pools of lantern light swallowed quickly by long stretches of shadow. It wasn't just the opium dens that felt alive after dark. It was the entire city, humming with secrets, schemes, and whispers no one dared say aloud in daylight. She could hear footsteps, faint but steady, just far enough behind her to make her wonder if she was being followed. Inside one of the larger dens, the air was a fog of incense and pipe smoke, thick enough to make the light from the oil lamps look like distant suns. Foreign traders lounged on padded benches, their eyes half closed, speaking in slow murmurs. Beside them sat locals in faded silk robes, their voices blending into the background hum. In one corner, a man in a dark western coat sat upright, watching everything, untouched by the haze around him. No pipe, no drink, no smile, just steady eyes scanning the room. People gave him a wide berth without realizing why. His name was Callahan, and though most thought he was just another traveler, he'd been in Shanghai for years. May pushed through the beaded curtain, trying to shake the feeling of eyes on her. The den's warmth wrapped around her like a trap, pulling her into its slow rhythm. The scents were intoxicating, sweet, smoky, almost comforting, but May knew better than to relax. She spotted Old Shanghai in the corner, the man who claimed to know the real owners of half the opium that moved through this district. His hands trembled as he reached for his tea, but his eyes were still sharp. May slid into the seat opposite him, lowering her voice to barely a whisper. "They know," she said, "and they're looking for you." Chen didn't flinch, but he took longer than usual to set his cup back on the table. "They always look," he replied softly, "but this time maybe they look too closely." His eyes darted to the man in the western coat. And maybe they're not the only ones. A sudden commotion broke out near the entrance. Two men, dock workers by the look of their stained jackets, were arguing with the doorman, their voices loud enough to cut through the haze. The room shifted, people subtly leaning in to listen without making it obvious. Arguments in these places were dangerous. They had a way of turning into something worse before anyone could leave. May caught sight of one of the dock workers slipping something into his coat pocket. It glinted briefly in the lamplight before disappearing again. Callahan's eyes narrowed. He rose from his seat, moving slowly but deliberately toward the scene. The dock workers noticed him too late. One tried to leave, but Callahan blocked the way with a casual stance that didn't look like much, until you noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands were loose at his sides but ready. "You've brought the wrong kind of trouble," he said in Mandarin, his voice calm but edged with warning. The dock worker hesitated, then glanced toward the back room where the dens kept their most trusted clientele. Something passed between him and the man guarding that door. Something quick and silent, but May caught it. A signal. She felt her stomach tighten. This wasn't just a random fight. It was a distraction. Chen leaned toward May, his voice barely audible. "If you see what I see, leave now." But May didn't move. The argument at the door had pulled most of the room's attention. Yet from the corner of her, she could see two figures slipping quietly toward the rear hallway. She recognized one of them, the same man who had been shadowing her earlier that evening. The den seemed to hold its breath as Callahan took another step forward. Outside, rain began to fall, a slow patter on the tiled roof, masking the sound of the back door opening. May knew she had seconds to decide. Follow the men into the hallway and risk whatever was waiting, or stay in the smoky room and hope Chen's warning was enough to keep her alive tonight. In the end, she stood. Her chair scraped the floor, the sound sharp in the muffled air. Chen didn't look at her, but his jaw tightened. Callahan's gaze flicked toward her for just an instant, his expression unreadable. She pushed through the haze, past the whispering patrons, and into the narrow hallway, her pulse loud in her ears. The light here was dimmer, the walls close. The air was colder too, smelling faintly of wet stone and river water. She could hear footsteps ahead, quick, purposeful, and the soft creak of a door being pushed open. She followed, her own steps quiet, careful. A shadow moved just around the corner. Then another. Voices, low, urgent, speaking in a dialect she couldn't fully catch. She reached the end of the hall and saw them in a small courtyard, standing under the weak glow of a single lantern. The man who had followed her earlier was speaking to someone in a wide-brimmed hat, their face hidden. The taller man handed over a small, lacquered box, the kind used to store things far more valuable than gold in this part of Shanghai. May couldn't see what was inside, but the way the lantern light caught the other man's eyes, sharp, satisfied, made her wish she hadn't come this far. The box disappeared into the folds of a dark coat. The man in the hat turned slightly, and though his face stayed in shadow, May caught a glimpse of something familiar in the way he moved. Before she could place it, the taller man's head snapped up. He'd heard her. The courtyard fell silent. The man in the hat didn't turn, but May could feel his attention on her like a weight. "Lost are we?" the tall man said softly. May's breath caught. The sound of rain on the rooftops seemed suddenly louder, the cold air sharper. Somewhere in the distance, the ship's horn sounded again, deeper this time, as if warning her she'd stepped too far into a story she wasn't meant to hear. And still, she didn't move. The rain came back that night, sweeping over the bund in long silver threads that caught the glow of the street lamps and blurred the shapes of people hurrying along the waterfront. Thomas sat inside the tea house on Nanjing Road, the air warm with steam and the scent of jasmine, but his thoughts were miles away. Across from him, May leaned forward, her elbows on the table, her dark eyes fixed on his face as if searching for answers he wasn't sure he had. She'd been trailing rumors for weeks now, rumors of a new shipment of opium so pure it had become the talk of the city's underground. It wasn't just another batch. People said it was connected to someone new, someone outside the usual network. Thomas stirred his tea slowly, his mind playing over the fragments he'd collected. whispers in the markets, cryptic warnings from dock workers, the sudden disappearance of two men who'd been regular faces in the French concessions gambling houses. None of it lined up neatly, but the feeling his gut told him something was shifting in the city. The old balance was being disturbed, and when that happened in Shanghai, people tended to vanish. From the corner of the room, the old storyteller began another of his nightly tales. His voice, raspy with age, carried through the low murmur of conversation. He spoke of a time when foreign traders first brought opium into the city, when ships from far-off ports unloaded their dark cargo under the cover of fog. His words painted images of narrow streets lit by paper lanterns, of small wooden pipes passed from hand to hand, of fortunes made and lives lost in the smoky haze of the dens. The story might have been meant to entertain, but Thomas noticed something else. A pause, a subtle lowering of the voice when certain names were mentioned, as if the past still had sharp teeth. May caught it too. Her gaze flicked toward the old man, then back to Thomas. "He knows something," she whispered. "They always put pieces of truth inside the stories. You just have to listen for what they leave out." The rain outside grew heavier, rattling against the tea house windows. Thomas leaned back in his chair, letting her words settle. If the old man's tale was more than entertainment, then perhaps the history of those early days, the first dens, the first alliances, held clues to whatever was unfolding now. Shanghai had always been a city built on layers, each new wave of power resting on the bones of the one before. To understand what was coming, you had to dig through the stories people thought they'd forgotten. May suggested they pay the storyteller for a private conversation. Thomas agreed, and soon they were sitting in the back room, the old man cradling a chipped porcelain cup between his thin hands. His eyes were clouded but sharp, as if they saw more than they let on. He spoke slowly, his words winding like the Huangpu River itself. He told them of a dockside warehouse long abandoned, once a hub for the most powerful opium ring in the city. It had been shut down decades ago, or so the official record claimed. But the old man swore that recently, shadows had been moving there again. Men carrying crates in the dead of night, a flicker of lantern light where there should have been only darkness. The name he gave them was unfamiliar, but May stiffened when she heard it. She'd seen it scribbled in the margin of an old police file weeks ago, one of the documents she'd managed to slip from an inattentive clerk's desk. The name hadn't been in the main report, just in someone's private notes. That meant it was important enough to keep off the official record. The rain eased by the time they left the tea house, but the streets still glistened, reflecting the signs and lamps in fractured colors. Thomas and May walked in silence, their minds working through what they'd learned. The warehouse wasn't far, but in Shanghai distance could be deceptive. Streets twisted unexpectedly, alleys seemed to appear and vanish, and you could walk for hours without realizing you'd been circling the same block. By the time they reached the dockside district, the fog was rolling in, muffling the sound of their footsteps. The buildings here were older, the wood darkened with age and salt air, the windows shuttered tight. They found the warehouse easily enough, a looming shape at the end of a narrow pier, its roofline jagged against the night sky. They kept their distance, crouched behind a stack of crates. The pier was quiet except for the slow lapping of water against the pilings. Thomas was starting to wonder if the old man had been wrong when a faint glimmer of light appeared between the warehouse boards. Moments later, a door opened just wide enough for a figure to slip inside. Another followed, carrying something heavy wrapped in canvas. May's hand brushed his. She didn't need to speak. He could feel her pulse quicken. Whoever these people were, they weren't casual visitors. And if the crates contained what he suspected, then they'd just found the first tangible link to the new player in Shanghai's opium trade. But Thomas also knew that getting too close tonight would be a mistake. You didn't walk into the lion's den without knowing how many lions were waiting. Instead, they watched from the shadows until the door closed again and the light vanished. On their way back, they passed a street where the air was thick with the smell of incense and fried dumplings. The sudden warmth and noise felt almost unreal after the silence of the docks. But beneath the chatter, Thomas kept thinking about that warehouse, about the way the men moved, quiet, deliberate, as if they'd done this 100 times before. And somewhere in that stillness was the same sense he'd felt when he first arrived in the city, that Shanghai was alive in ways most people couldn't see, and that its secrets weren't given up lightly. The deeper you went, the more you realized that the real power wasn't in the open, but in the hands of those who knew how to remain unseen. What Thomas didn't realize, what neither of them realized, was that someone else had been watching that night, and that their presence at the docks had not gone unnoticed. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the narrow Shanghai alleyways into slick rivers of reflection. Every flicker of lantern light on the puddles seemed to stretch the shadows longer, making the streets feel like they belonged to another world entirely. The damp smell of the city mixed with the faint, sweet trace of opium drifting from behind closed doors, and every time someone passed by with their collar pulled high, it felt as if they were carrying secrets tucked deep into their pockets. The city was wide awake, but it wasn't in a hurry. It breathed in slow, heavy rhythms, like an old dragon guarding something precious or dangerous. A covered rickshaw stopped just short of an alley lined with red paper lanterns. The driver kept his head low under the brim of his straw hat, speaking only in short, gruff murmurs. Inside sat a figure wrapped in a dark coat, clutching a small leather case, as if letting go of it would invite disaster. From a distance, they looked like just another traveler seeking shelter from the weather, but the way their eyes darted to every corner told a different story. The driver dropped them off without asking for payment, a gesture that hinted at an unspoken arrangement. The passengers stepped out, their shoes splashing into a shallow puddle, then disappeared into the alley without looking back. Inside one of the buildings, behind a lacquered wooden door carved with dragons, the air was warm and thick with haze. The opium den was quiet, almost eerily so, as if the sounds of the outside world couldn't quite pass through. Men and women reclined on wooden couches padded with worn silk cushions, their faces half lit by the dim glow of oil lamps. The smoke hung like a soft curtain in the room, blurring edges, turning people into moving shadows. Some lay perfectly still, their expressions distant and unreadable, while others murmured softly in languages from every corner of the earth. A soft tune from a stringed instrument drifted from somewhere in the back, and though it was beautiful, it carried an unsettling melancholy. In a corner, a young man with sharp eyes sat upright, not smoking, not speaking, just watching. His clothes were simple, but too clean for someone who truly belonged here. A few times, his gaze flickered toward the entrance, as if expecting someone. When the figure in the dark coat entered, his shoulders tensed, but he didn't move. The two locked eyes for a brief moment, then broke it just as quickly, both pretending not to notice. But they didn't notice. The den's proprietor, an older woman with silver hair pinned neatly into a bun, floated between the reclining guests with an ease that came from decades in this business. Her voice was soft and polite, her smile warm, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. She had seen every kind of person pass through her doors, the wealthy seeking escape, the poor chasing comfort, the wanderers looking for something they couldn't name. And she knew the moment someone stepped inside, whether they were here for pleasure, for business, or for something far more dangerous. When her gaze landed on the figure with the leather case, her smile deepened just slightly, though her mind was already turning over questions. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof and splattering against the window panes. The street lamps flickered, as if the storm was trying to swallow the city whole. Somewhere down the alley, a shout rang out, quick, sharp, and quickly silenced. No one inside moved to investigate. In Shanghai, especially in these parts, people learned quickly that survival depended on looking the other way. Back inside, the young man in the corner shifted, standing as if to leave. But instead of heading to the door, he crossed the room slowly, each step deliberate, until he reached the table where the figure in the dark coat now sat. Without asking, he lowered himself into the seat opposite. For a moment, neither spoke. The sounds of the den, soft music, the quiet exhale of smoke, the rain outside, filled the silence between them. Finally, He leaned forward just slightly and said something too quiet for the rest of the room to hear. The person with the coat didn't respond right away. They opened the leather case just enough for him to see what was inside. Whatever it was, it made his jaw tighten. He reached for it instinctively, but the case snapped shut before he could touch it. The two stared at each other again, tension stretched so thin it might have snapped if anyone else had looked too closely. From across the room, the proprietor watched without expression. But deep down, she knew something had just shifted. Deals like this didn't happen here. Not unless the stakes were high enough to risk everything. And in her experience, when that happened, someone always paid a price. Outside, thunder rolled low and long, echoing through the narrow streets. Somewhere in the distance, a police whistle cut through the night, sharp and urgent. But here in the den, time seemed to slow, the air heavy with unasked questions and unspoken danger. No one moved to leave. They were waiting for something, or perhaps bracing for it. And when the door creaked open again, letting in a rush of cold, wet air, every eye in the room turned to see who had just stepped inside. The knock at Li Wei's door was softer this time, almost hesitant, but it still made his heart race. He hesitated before answering, staring at the flickering candlelight, as though it might tell him whether this was friend or foe. When he finally opened it, the narrow hallway was empty, except for a folded scrap of paper lying on the floor. No name, no seal, just a short line scrawled in hurried ink. She knows about the night by the docks. His hand shook slightly as he read it again, the words somehow heavier than the silence pressing in around him. The night by the docks was something he had promised never to speak of again. It was the kind of night that made a man older in an instant. It was where the rain had mixed with the smell of the harbor and something else, something metallic, and where the shadows had seemed to whisper in voices not his own. Only 3 people had been there that night, and one of them had vanished soon after. If someone knew, then either the past was about to surface, or someone was about to use it against him. When he returned to the table, Marin was gone. In her place, a small porcelain teacup sat upside down, hiding something underneath. He lifted it and found a thin silver coin stamped with the image of a lotus flower. He hadn't seen one of those in years, not since the time when the opium dens were at their most dangerous, when every coin pass between hands carried more meaning than money could explain. In the old days, the lotus coin meant a meeting, but it never meant a friendly one. Li Wei pocketed the coin and stepped outside, his shoes crunching over the damp stones of the alley. The air smelled of old rain and smoke from the braziers that still burned faintly in front of the tea houses. He turned toward the western quarter, where the river bent in on itself like a sleeping serpent. The lotus coin meant the meeting would be at the hidden house, hidden in name only, because those who were meant to find it always did. As he walked, he couldn't shake the sense that someone was following him. The sound of footsteps behind him was never quite in rhythm with his own, and every time he glanced back, there was only the shifting outline of strangers in the dim lamplight. Still, the sensation clung to him like a wet cloak. When he reached the house, the shutters were closed and the front door slightly ajar, the smell of incense drifting out in thin ribbons. He stepped inside, greeted not by voices but by the soft creak of floorboards above. The room was dim, the air thick with the scent of sandalwood and something sharper, opium, faint but unmistakable. At the far end of the room, a curtain swayed gently as though someone had just passed through it. Before he could move, a voice came from behind him, low and almost amused. "You took your time." He turned, and for the first time in years saw the face of Yun Zhao. She was older now, but her eyes hadn't changed. They still held that sharp glint like a blade half drawn. She stepped into the light, her fingers brushing over the lotus coin he'd brought. "Do you remember," she said, "what you swore that night? That none of us would speak? That the truth would die on the docks." Her tone was calm, but her presence made the room feel smaller. "I remember," he said carefully, "which is why I'm wondering why you sent for me." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the small table in the center of the room and set down a bundle wrapped in black cloth. When she unfolded it, Li Wei saw a ledger, old, worn, the pages yellowed and brittle at the edges. The handwriting was precise, almost elegant, and each page was filled with names, dates, and locations. At the bottom of the first page was a single symbol, a lotus flower. This, Yun Zhao said, is what they've been looking for. The foreigners, the ones buying up the houses along the river. They think it's just a record of debts. But it's more than that. Every name here belongs to someone tied to the dens, and to the people who controlled them. She looked up at him then, her voice dropping. And your name is in it. Li Wei felt the room tilt slightly. His name. After all these years, after the silence, after the promises. He reached for the ledger, but she pulled it back sharply. Not yet, she said. There's something you need to hear first. The man you thought disappeared after the docks. He didn't vanish. He's here, in Shanghai, and he's asking about you. The words landed like cold water. Li Wei tried to piece together how this could be true, but the only images that came to him were of that rain-slick night, the sound of boots on wet wood, and the way the river had swallowed the noise. If the man had survived, then everything they had built in silence was about to crumble. You think he wants revenge? Li Wei asked quietly. I think, Yin Zhao said, he wants to finish what he started, and I think he's already closer than you realize. The floor creaked again above them. This time, it wasn't faint, it was deliberate, steady. Yin Zhao's eyes flicked to the ceiling, then back to him. They didn't need words to know they were both thinking the same thing. They weren't alone in the house. The room was thick with silence after Wei's sudden departure. No one moved, as if even the air feared to stir. Chun sat hunched over the low table, staring at the empty teacup as though it held some answer he had missed. Mei stood by the doorway, her shadow cast long by the flickering lantern behind her, eyes locked on the street outside. The sounds of the alley, faint footsteps, the muffled cough of a rickshaw driver, the rustle of paper, felt sharper now, each one carrying the weight of something unseen. Chen's mind spun. Wei had spoken of someone higher than the gangs, someone who could order the disappearance of entire streets without question. If such a person existed, it meant the opium dens were only a piece of a much larger web. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones wet and glistening like black glass. A cool breeze carried the smell of the river mixed with faint traces of smoke, as though the whole city had been steeped in quiet dread. Mei finally turned to Chun. We can't go back to the lantern house, she said softly. Not tonight. They'll be watching it. She didn't wait for him to agree. She stepped into the alley, her coat pulled tight. Chun followed without a word, their footsteps quick but not hurried, blending into the flow of late-night wanderers who clung to the shadows. They wound through back streets where the buildings leaned close, whispering secrets to each other. Small windows glowed dimly with the light of oil lamps, and behind them, silhouettes moved, ordinary lives continuing as if the city wasn't slowly tightening its grip around itself. Chin noticed they were heading toward the northern edge of the French concession, a place where the narrow lanes gave way to wider roads and the scent of perfume sometimes replaced the acrid tang of smoke. But there was no comfort here tonight. Ahead, a group of men in dark coats leaned against a wall, speaking in low voices. Mei slowed without turning her head toward them. They took a sharp turn into another alley, where the lanterns had long gone dark, and only the faint gleam of the moon lit their way. The damp stone walls here were etched with faded posters, their slogans half peeled away. Chen reached out to steady himself against the wall, and his fingers brushed something carved into the stone, a symbol, small and deliberate. It was a circle with 3 curved lines inside, almost like a coiled dragon. Mei saw it too. Her face tightened. This mark, it means we're too close, she whispered. Before Chun could ask what she meant, a shadow moved at the far end of the alley. Then another, and another. Shapes emerging from the darkness, slow but deliberate, until the path behind them was no longer open. Mei grabbed Chin's arm and pulled him through a narrow gap between 2 buildings, the walls so tight their shoulders scraped the damp brick. They emerged into a courtyard, empty except for a small shrine with fresh incense curling into the air. The scent was oddly sweet, almost cloying. Chun felt it catch in his throat. Mei's eyes scanned the perimeter, searching for another exit, but the sound of footsteps came from every direction. Then, from the shadows, a voice spoke, a voice neither of them expected. "You should have stayed where I left you." It was Old Wu, the harmless tea seller from the corner shop near the lantern house. But now he wasn't smiling. The warm twinkle in his eye was gone, replaced by something hard and cold. Behind him, 4 men stepped forward, each carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from never needing to shout. Old Wu continued, "You've wandered too far into the current, and currents in this city, they drag you under." Mei stepped in front of Chun. "We're not here to fight," she said, her voice calm but steady. "We just want the truth." Old Wu tilted his head, considering her words. "The truth? The truth is what keeps people alive. Lies are what keep the city standing." His words hung in the damp air, heavy with implication. Chun felt the weight of it settling in his chest. It wasn't just about the opium anymore. It was about the scaffolding of power holding the city together and how fragile it really was. One of Wu's men stepped forward, pulling a small folded paper from his coat. He handed it to Chun without a word. Chun opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a rough sketch of a street map, marked with red ink. There were 3 circles, each connected by thin lines, forming a triangle that encompassed part of the old city and the edge of the river docks. In the center of the triangle was the same coiled dragon symbol Chun had seen carved into the wall earlier. Mei leaned closer. "This is it. This is where they control everything." Old Wu watched them study the paper. "You have until the next moon to forget this," he said finally. "After that, well, some people are never seen again." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his men following like shadows until they melted into the alleys. Chun and Mei stood alone in the courtyard, the faint scent of incense still lingering, as if the shrine itself had been listening to everything. They didn't speak as they made their way toward the river, where the lights of the foreign ships shimmered on the black water. Mei's mind was racing, and she could feel Chen's unease matching her own. The map was more than just a clue. It was a warning, maybe even a trap. But it was also the only lead they had. Somewhere inside that triangle of streets lay the heart of the network, the place where the opium dens, the gangs, and the unseen powers all converged. And if they were going to step into that heart, they would have to be ready to face whatever was waiting there. The wind off the water carried a chill, and with it, the faint sound of music drifting from one of the foreign clubs on the bund. The laughter and brass instruments felt like another world entirely, bright, careless, and oblivious. But here on the dark riverbank, Chun and Mei stood between 2 worlds, each step pulling them deeper into a current neither could escape. And somewhere, in the unseen parts of the city, someone already knew they had the map and was deciding what to do about it. The night had grown still, almost unnaturally so, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Every shadow seemed sharper, every sound more pronounced, and the silence pressed down like a weight. Alex stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on the small cabin where everything was about to reach its breaking point. The truth was no longer a distant puzzle. It was here within reach, and yet it felt heavier than they had imagined. Inside, the dim glow of a single lamp flickered against the windows, distorting the silhouettes moving within. Sam's voice was low but urgent. "Once we step inside, there's no going back." Alex nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle in their chest. They pushed forward, boots crunching softly against the damp ground, until they reached the door. A deep breath, a shared glance, and then the latch clicked open. The room inside was cramped, the air thick with the smell of old wood and something metallic. The figure at the table looked up, startled but not entirely surprised. It was Elias, the man who had been the ghost behind every clue, the shadow behind every move they had made. His expression was calm, almost resigned, as if he had been expecting them. "I was wondering how long it would take you," he said, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of fatigue. "You've been playing both sides," Alex said, stepping closer, "feeding us just enough truth to keep us chasing you, while making sure the real plan stayed hidden." Elias's lips curled into a faint smile. "And you still came? That tells me you're not as sure about the truth as you think." Sam's eyes narrowed. Then why don't you tell us? Tell us why you've been pulling the strings. Elias leaned back, fingers drumming against the table. Because it's not just my plan. You think this ends with me? You have no idea who's really in control. The words landed like a blow. Every theory they had built suddenly felt fragile. Alex glanced at Sam, sensing the same dread mirrored in their expression. Before either could press further, the sound of footsteps outside made the floorboards tremble. Heavy, deliberate steps, growing louder. Elias looked toward the door, his composure breaking just enough to show a flash of concern. You didn't come alone, he muttered, but it didn't sound like a question. The door burst open, and in stepped a tall figure in a dark coat, face obscured by the shadows. The tension in the room turned suffocating. You've all been very busy, the newcomer said, voice deep and measured. But I'm here to make sure none of this gets out. Sam shifted closer to Alex, their stance protective. Elias, however, didn't move. He simply watched, almost as if he had been waiting for this person to arrive. You took your time, Elias said bitterly. I was starting to think you'd left me to clean up your mess. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time, the light caught their face. It wasn't someone Alex recognized, but the familiarity in their sharp gaze and deliberate movements was undeniable. They weren't just another player in this game. They were the one who had designed it. You've both been useful, the figure said, looking between Alex and Sam. But this is where your involvement ends. A subtle nod to Elias followed, but instead of standing with the stranger, Elias pushed back his chair and stood between them and Alex. No, he said firmly. They deserve to know. The betrayal was instant, the stranger's expression tightening. You're making a mistake. I've made plenty, Elias replied. This won't be one of them. What happened next blurred into motion. Alex saw the stranger reach into their coat, saw Sam move faster than they thought possible, and heard the clatter of something metallic hitting the floor. In the struggle, the lamp toppled, casting the room into chaotic shadows. Voices rose, footsteps thudded, and the tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. When the dust settled, the stranger was gone, slipping into the night like they had never been there at all. Elias leaned against the table, breathing hard. That was your real enemy, he said quietly. The one who's been making sure none of you see the full picture. But you worked for them, Alex said, disbelief mixing with frustration. I worked with them, Elias corrected, until I realized what they were planning would destroy everything. He looked directly at Alex. You've been chasing me for answers, but now you need to decide whether you want the truth or if you want to survive. It was the kind of choice that left no room for both. Outside, the night remained silent, but the stillness no longer felt empty. It was heavy, charged, as if something far bigger was still moving in the dark, waiting for them to make their next move. And in that silence, Alex understood one thing. The climax they had just lived through wasn't the end. It was only the edge of a much deeper, far more dangerous truth. The rain had turned into a steady downpour by the time they reached the edge of the old rail yard. The place was half forgotten, swallowed by weeds and rust, but it still carried a strange energy, as if the air itself remembered what had happened there years ago. Every step forward felt heavier, not because of the mud clinging to their boots, but because of the weight of what they knew was coming. The wind cut through the night, carrying with it the faint metallic tang of old iron and oil, a scent that only added to the unease building in the group. Rebecca scanned the shadows between the derelict train cars, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. She could hear Navarro's footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, each one sinking into the wet earth. The others kept their distance, instinctively falling into a quiet formation as they approached the largest of the rusted boxcars. Inside, faint movement caught her eye, not the kind that came from the wind or rain, but something alive, deliberate. She raised a hand to signal the group to stop, her pulse hammering against her ribs. The sound came again, a soft scrape like metal against metal. It was too rhythmic to be random. Navarro met her eyes, his jaw tightening, and in that split second, they both knew they were standing at the edge of whatever truth had been chasing them all this time. They moved in closer, slow enough not to make a sound, but fast enough to cut off any escape. The beam of her flashlight finally landed on the source of the noise, and her breath caught. It wasn't what she had expected. Not Jeremy, not another shadow from the past, but a man they'd both seen before in a very different context. He was hunched over a heavy steel container, hands working feverishly on a latch that seemed almost fused shut with rust. The rain soaked through his coat, plastering his hair to his head, but he didn't stop, didn't even glance up. Rebecca took a step forward, her voice low but steady. "Step away from it." The man froze, shoulders tensing, and then slowly straightened. When he turned, the light caught his face, and the recognition hit her like a punch. He was the same archivist who had warned them weeks ago to stop digging before it's too late. Only now, his expression wasn't one of caution. It was one of desperation. Navarro moved closer, his voice sharper. "What's in the box?" The archivist's gaze flicked between them, calculating. "It's the only piece left," he said finally, his tone low but urgent. "If they find it before we do, none of this will matter." The words only deepened the questions that had been piling up, but before Rebecca could press him, a sudden crash erupted from the far side of the rail yard. The sound was sharp and heavy, like something massive had been dropped. All three of them turned toward it, and in that moment, the archivist bolted. Rebecca cursed under her breath, starting after him, but Navarro grabbed her arm. "We don't split up. Not now." Another crash echoed through the rain. This one closer, followed by a deep, unsettling hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. It wasn't mechanical, at least not entirely. It felt almost alive. Rebecca's flashlight beam wavered as the sound grew louder, vibrating through her bones. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the boxcars, shapes began to move, slow, deliberate, and just far enough away to be nothing more than silhouettes. The archivist was gone, swallowed by the night, but the steel container sat where he'd left it, the latch still half undone. Rebecca felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, but Navarro's hand on her shoulder stopped her again. "We opened that, and there's no going back." His voice wasn't angry, just certain, as if he already knew what was inside. She searched his face for a moment, but before she could ask, a sharp beam of light cut through the rain from the far side of the yard. More figures emerged, their outlines crisp against the glare. They weren't strangers. They were the same operatives who had been shadowing them for days. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The operatives spread out, moving with a precision that made it clear they weren't here to talk. Rebecca's heart pounded, her mind running through every possible move. The container, the approaching shadows, the missing archivist, it all pressed in on her at once. She and Navarro exchanged a look, and without a word, they both understood. They would have to hold their ground, even if it meant standing against forces they didn't fully understand yet. The hum beneath their feet intensified, the rain masking nothing now. Whatever was about to happen, it would change everything, and there would be no room for hesitation. Somewhere deep down, Rebecca realized they had reached the point where the truth could no longer hide in the dark. But it was also the point where knowing it might be the most dangerous thing of all. The silence that followed was almost heavier than the chaos that had come before. Everyone stood still, as if afraid to breathe, like the whole scene might collapse into nothing if they moved too quickly. The air was thick with the kind of tension that takes hours to fade, even when the danger has passed. And yet, as the dust settled, there was a quiet sense of relief, fragile but real. The main threat was gone, though the echoes of what had happened would stay with them far longer than they could imagine. The team looked at one another, their expressions a mix of exhaustion, disbelief, and something unspoken. Bonds had been formed in the fire, in the unlikeliest ways. People who had started this journey at odds now stood side by side, united not by agreement, but by the trials they had endured. It was strange how shared struggle could turn strangers into something like family, even if none of them would admit it out loud. Still, questions lingered. There were pieces that didn't quite fit, things said in haste, actions that didn't match the expected patterns, small details that gnawed at the back of the mind. Even as they moved towards safety, some couldn't shake the thought that maybe this wasn't entirely over. It was an uneasy kind of victory, the sort that made you glance over your shoulder more than you celebrated. For those who had carried the greatest weight, there was no instant relief. They knew that surviving was only the first step. There would be explanations to give, reports to file, and a long road of trust to rebuild. The truth was a slippery thing now. Some of it would need to be told. Some of it might need to be buried. And each of them would have to live with the choices they made in that gray space between right and wrong. When the first rays of morning touched the horizon, it was as if the night had finally given them permission to rest. The light didn't erase the scars of what happened, but it did make it easier to believe they could move forward. People began speaking in quieter tones, their words more measured, as if trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. They shared small jokes, exchanged tired smiles, and clung to the little signs that life could go on. In the days that followed, they each returned to their corners of the world, carrying with them stories they would tell, or choose not to tell, for years to come. Some found themselves replaying the events over and over, wondering if a single different choice might have changed the outcome. Others accepted that what was done and turned their focus to what lay ahead. Either way, the memory lingered like the faint outline of a scar, not always visible, but always there. There were moments of quiet reflection when they thought about the people they'd met along the way, the allies they never expected, the enemies who revealed unexpected humanity, and the ones they lost before the end. Every face carried a lesson. Every choice left a mark. And while the road forward would not be simple, there was a shared understanding now of what they were capable of, for better or worse. Even as they settled into their new routines, small reminders kept the story alive. A name mentioned in passing, a news headline that hinted at the ripples still spreading, a sound, a scent, a glance that brought it all rushing back. And sometimes, late at night, the thought would creep in, maybe the ending wasn't as final as they had believed. But life has a way of moving, no matter how much the past tries to pull you back. They found themselves choosing to live in the present, even as the shadows of the past stretched long behind them. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about carrying those lessons forward, letting them shape the way they navigated what came next. By the time weeks had passed, the urgency of that night had faded, replaced by something quieter but just as important. It was a deep, steady resilience, a quiet promise to themselves that if they were ever tested again, they would stand their ground, together or apart. And in that way, the ending was not about closure, but about preparation for whatever might come. In the end, they didn't walk away unscathed, but they walked away stronger. The fear they'd felt in those moments had turned into something else, resolve. And while the world outside would never fully understand what had happened, the ones who had been there carried the truth in their own way. Sometimes heavy, sometimes light, but always with them. They had faced the worst of it and found a way through. And that was enough for now. The story didn't need a perfect ending. It just needed the quiet certainty that, no matter how unpredictable the road ahead might be, they were ready to walk it,